The last thing Mark Thompson remembered was his daughter Emma, waving to him from the middle of the lake, her bright smile reflecting the afternoon sunshine. Seconds later, she was gone, pulled under by forces no one could explain. For 5 years, he blamed himself for letting her swim alone. But when an old GoPro camera washed up on shore with footage from that tragic day, Mark discovered that Emma's disappearance was far from accidental, and the person responsible had been watching them the entire time. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Mark Thompson had always been protective of his daughter Emma, perhaps more so than most fathers. As a single parent, raising a 12-year-old girl, he felt the weight of responsibility every day. But Emma wasn't like other children her age. She was mature beyond her years, incredibly intelligent, and most notably, an exceptional swimmer, who seemed more at home in the water than on land. The morning of September 12, 2019, started like many others for the Thompson family. Emma had finished her morning swim practice at the local aquatic center and was eager to spend the afternoon at Mirror Lake, their favorite weekend destination about an hour outside of Denver, Colorado. The lake was a hidden gem, surrounded by pine trees and mountains, with crystal clear water that was perfect for swimming. Mark had discovered Mirror Lake 3 years earlier, when Emma was just 9 years old. She had immediately fallen in love with the pristine water and the peaceful atmosphere, unlike the crowded public pools where she trained. Mirror Lake offered her the freedom to swim in open water, practicing her stroke technique and building the endurance that was making her one of the most promising young swimmers in the state. "Dad, can we go to Mirror Lake today?" Emma had asked that morning, her eyes bright with anticipation. "I want to practice my distance swimming for next month's championship." Mark looked at his daughter, noting the determination in her voice. Emma had been training for the Colorado State Junior Swimming Championships for months, and her coach had told Mark that she had a real chance of placing in the top 3 in her age group for the 800-meter freestyle. "Are you sure you're not tired from this morning's practice?" Mark asked, though he already knew what her answer would be. "Dad, I'm never too tired to swim," Emma replied with a grin. "Besides, the water at Mirror Lake is so much better than the chlorinated pool. I can actually breathe properly there." Mark smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. Emma had been swimming competitively since she was 7 years old, and her passion for the sport had only grown stronger over the years. Her coach, Janet Morrison, often said that Emma had a natural feel for the water that couldn't be taught. She seemed to understand instinctively how to move efficiently through it, how to read the currents, and how to conserve energy for long distances. They packed their usual supplies: towels, sunscreen, snacks, and plenty of water. Mark also brought his camping chair and a book, knowing that Emma would want to spend hours in the water. He had learned to enjoy these afternoons at the lake, finding peace in watching his daughter do what she loved most. The drive to Mirror Lake took them through winding mountain roads with stunning views of the Colorado landscape. Emma chatted excitedly about her upcoming championship meet, discussing strategy with the kind of technical knowledge that impressed Mark every time he heard it. "Coach Morrison says I need to work on my flip turns if I want to shave off those last few seconds," Emma explained as they drove. "She thinks I can break the state record for my age group if I can just get my technique perfect." Mark nodded, listening to his daughter's analysis of her swimming performance. He had learned more about competitive swimming in the past 5 years than he had ever expected to know, and he was constantly amazed by Emma's dedication and understanding of the sport. They arrived at Mirror Lake around 2 p.m. The parking area was small and usually empty, which was one of the reasons they loved coming there. Today was no different. They had the entire lake to themselves. Emma immediately began her pre-swim routine, which had become almost ritualistic over the years. She did her stretching exercises, checked the water temperature with her hand, and studied the lake surface to assess the condition. "Perfect," she announced after her inspection. "No wind, water temperature feels perfect, and visibility looks great." Mark set up his chair, about 20 feet from the water's edge, positioning himself where he could easily keep an eye on Emma throughout her swim. He had established this routine early on, never allowing Emma to swim without his direct supervision, even though she was probably a stronger swimmer than most adults. Emma waded into the water slowly, acclimating herself to the temperature. Even in September, the mountain lake was quite cold, but Emma had grown accustomed to it over the years. She preferred the cold water, claiming that it made her feel more alert and focused. "I'm going to do some distance work today," Emma called to her father. "Probably swim out to the middle and back a few times." Mark waved his acknowledgement. He had measured the distance from shore to the center of the lake at approximately 200 meters, making a round trip about 400 meters. Emma often did multiple laps, sometimes swimming continuously for over an hour. Emma began with her warm-up, swimming an easy freestyle stroke, parallel to the shore. Mark watched her technique, noting the smooth rhythm of her stroke and the minimal splash she created. Her form was nearly perfect, the result of years of coaching and countless hours of practice. After about 10 minutes of warm-up swimming, Emma transitioned to her distance work. She began swimming directly toward the center of the lake, her stroke settling into the steady, efficient rhythm that she used for long-distance events. Mark opened his book, but found himself frequently looking up to check on Emma's progress. This was his usual pattern. He tried to read while she swam, but his parental instincts kept him constantly aware of her location in the water. Emma reached the center of the lake and treaded water for a moment, looking back toward shore. She waved to Mark, and he waved back, noting that she looked strong and comfortable in the water. The afternoon sun created a beautiful reflection on the lake's surface, making Emma's figure appear almost ethereal as she floated in the middle of the pristine water. What happened next would be replayed in Mark's mind thousands of times over the following years. Emma had just begun her return swim toward shore when she suddenly stopped. Mark looked up from his book just in time to see her raise her hand. Not in a wave, but in what appeared to be a gesture of confusion or distress. "Emma," Mark called out, though he knew she was too far away to hear him clearly. For a moment Emma seemed to be treading water normally, but then Mark noticed that something was wrong. Her movements appeared erratic, and she seemed to be struggling to stay at the surface. Mark stood up from his chair, dropping his book. "Emma," he shouted, his voice carrying across the water. Emma's head went under for a moment, then popped back up. She appeared to be trying to swim toward shore, but her normally smooth stroke looked panicked and inefficient. Mark could see that she was in distress, but he couldn't understand why. Emma was such a strong swimmer that the idea of her having trouble in the water seemed impossible. "Emma, are you okay?" Mark yelled, though he was already moving toward the water's edge. Emma's head went under again, and this time it didn't immediately reappear. Mark waited for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. When Emma's head broke the surface again, she was clearly struggling. Mark didn't hesitate. Despite being a mediocre swimmer himself, he dove into the cold water and began swimming toward his daughter as fast as he could. The 2,000-meter distance that Emma covered effortless seemed endless to Mark as he struggled through the water. As he swam, Mark kept his eyes fixed on the spot where he had last seen Emma. But as he got closer, he realized with growing horror that she was no longer visible on the surface. The lake, which had been perfectly calm moments before, now seemed vast and threatening. Mark reached the general area where Emma had been swimming and began diving underwater, desperately searching for any sign of his daughter. The water was clear enough that he could see several feet in any direction, but there was no trace of Emma. He surfaced, gasping for air, and called her name repeatedly. "Emma! Emma! Where are you?" The only response was the echo of his own voice bouncing off the surrounding mountains. Mark continued diving and searching, pushing himself far beyond his normal swimming abilities. The cold water was quickly sapping his strength, but he refused to give up. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, Mark was forced to acknowledge that he needed help. Emma had simply vanished, and he was approaching exhaustion. With tremendous difficulty, he swam back to shore and immediately called 911. "What's your emergency?" "My daughter. She's missing in Mirror Lake. She was swimming and she just disappeared." Mark gasped into the phone, still struggling to catch his breath. The emergency dispatcher remained calm and professional. gathering the necessary information while simultaneously dispatching rescue teams. Within 30 minutes, the lake was swarming with emergency responders. The rescue operation was extensive and professional. Dive teams from 3 different counties converged on Mirror Lake, along with helicopter support and specialized underwater search equipment. The operation continued for 5 days, covering every square foot of the lake bottom. Detective Sarah Chen from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office was assigned to coordinate the search and investigate the circumstances of Emma's disappearance. She interviewed Mark extensively, trying to understand exactly what had happened. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to walk me through everything you saw, from the moment Emma entered the water until the moment she disappeared," Detective Chen said during one of their sessions. Mark recounted the events in detail, describing Emma's normal warm-up routine, her swim to the center of the lake, and the sudden change in her behavior that had preceded her disappearance. "You mentioned that Emma seemed to be in distress," Chen noted. "Can you describe exactly what you saw?" Mark struggled to find the right words. "It was like something was pulling her down. She's such a strong swimmer, Detective. She could swim for hours without getting tired. What I saw wasn't Emma having trouble swimming. It was Emma fighting against something." The dive teams found no trace of Emma's body, which was unusual for a drowning in a lake as small and well-contained as Mirror Lake. Typically, even in cases where victims drowned in open water, the body would be recovered within a few days. It's possible that the body could be trapped under a submerged log or rock formation, the lead diver explained to Mark. "But we've searched every possible location where that could occur. I've never seen a case like this." The investigation expanded to include the possibility of foul play. Detective Chen questioned other visitors to the area, reviewed traffic patterns on the access road, and investigated whether anyone with criminal intent might have been present at the lake that day. "We found no evidence of any other individuals in the area at the time of Emma's disappearance," Chen told Mark after a week of investigation. "The access road has only one way in and out, and our canvassing of the area found no witnesses who saw anyone else at the lake that day." The official conclusion was that Emma had drowned due to unknown circumstances, possibly a medical emergency such as a cramp or seizure that had caused her to lose consciousness in the water. The fact that her body hadn't been recovered was attributed to the lake's unique geology and possible underwater currents that might have carried her to an inaccessible location. Mark refused to accept this explanation. He knew Emma better than anyone, and the idea that she had simply drowned made no sense to him. He hired a private investigator and continued searching for answers long after the official investigation was closed. The private investigator, a former police detective named Robert Walsh, reviewed all the evidence and conducted his own interviews. He was particularly interested in the lack of a body and the unusual circumstances surrounding Emma's apparent distress in the water. "In my experience," Walsh told Mark, "when a strong swimmer like Emma disappears without a trace, there's usually more to the story than a simple drowning." Walsh's investigation uncovered some interesting information about Mirror Lake's history. Over the past 20 years, there had been 3 other unexplained disappearances in the area, 2 hikers and 1 camper, who had all vanished without a trace. None of these cases had been solved. "It could be coincidence," Walsh admitted, "but the pattern is unusual. All of these disappearances involved people who were experienced in outdoor activities and wouldn't normally be expected to get into trouble." Despite Walsh's efforts, no concrete evidence of foul play was ever discovered. After 6 months of investigation, he was forced to conclude that while Emma's disappearance was highly unusual, there wasn't enough evidence to determine what had actually happened to her. Mark's life changed completely after Emma's disappearance. He took extended leave from his job as an engineer and devoted himself entirely to searching for answers. He returned to Mirror Lake dozens of times, sometimes camping there for days, hoping to find some clue that had been missed. He also became involved with organizations that help families of missing persons, finding some comfort in connecting with other parents who understood his pain. Through these connections, he learned about new search techniques and technologies that might be applicable to Emma's case. One of the most difficult aspects of Emma's disappearance was the lack of closure. Without a body, Mark found it impossible to accept that his daughter was really gone. He oscillated between hope that she was somehow still alive and despair that he would never know what had happened to her. The not knowing is the worst part, Mark explained to a support group for families of missing persons. At least if I knew what had happened, I could grieve properly. But this limbo is unbearable. Emma's swimming coach, Janet Morrison, was deeply affected by her disappearance. She had coached Emma for 5 years and had watched her develop from a talented child into a potential Olympic prospect. Emma had the kind of natural ability that comes along maybe once in a coach's career. Morrison told Mark during one of their conversations. But more than that, she had the heart and determination to go with the talent. She could have gone all the way to the Olympics. The swimming community rallied around Mark and Emma's memory. The local aquatic center established a scholarship in Emma's name for young swimmers who showed exceptional promise but needed financial assistance. The Colorado Swimming Association dedicated their next state championship meet to Emma's memory. These gestures, while meaningful, did little to ease Mark's pain. He found himself avoiding the aquatic center and anything else that reminded him of Emma's swimming career. The sport that had brought them so much joy together now served only as a painful reminder of what he had lost. 2 years after Emma's disappearance, Mark finally returned to work, though his heart wasn't really in it. His colleagues were understanding and supportive, but Mark found it difficult to focus on engineering projects when his mind was constantly occupied with thoughts of Emma. He moved to a smaller apartment, unable to bear living in the house where Emma had grown up. Her room had remained exactly as she had left it, but being surrounded by her belongings every day was too painful. Mark also began seeing a therapist, Dr. Lisa Martinez, who specialized in helping families cope with ambiguous loss, the unique grief experienced by those who have lost someone without confirmation of death. Ambiguous loss is particularly difficult because it prevents the normal grieving process, Dr. Martinez explained to Mark. Your mind can't fully accept the loss, because there's always the possibility, however remote, that Emma is still alive somewhere. The therapy helped Mark develop coping strategies, but it didn't eliminate his need to know what had happened to his daughter. He continued to visit Mirror Lake regularly, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting by the water and remembering the happy times he and Emma had shared there. 3 years after Emma's disappearance, Mark received an unexpected call from Detective Chen. She had been promoted to sergeant, but had never forgotten about Emma's case. Mr. Thompson, we've received a report of human remains found in a remote area about 50 miles from Mirror Lake, Chen told him. The description matches Emma's general characteristics. I know this is difficult, but we'd like you to be prepared for the possibility that we may need you for identification. Mark's heart raced as he drove to the sheriff's office. After 3 years of uncertainty, he might finally have answers about what had happened to Emma. But when he arrived, Chen delivered disappointing news. The dental records don't match, she told him gently. These remains belong to someone else. I'm sorry to have raised your hopes. Mark was surprised by his own reaction. Instead of disappointment, he felt relief. Some part of him still wasn't ready to accept that Emma was gone, and the lack of confirmation allowed him to maintain hope, however irrational it might be. 4 years after Emma's disappearance, Mark decided to return to Mirror Lake for what he told himself would be the last time. He had been going through Emma's belongings, preparing to donate her swimming equipment and trophies, when he found her training log from the summer before she disappeared. Reading Emma's own words about her swimming goals and her excitement about the upcoming championship meet was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She had written about her love for Mirror Lake and how swimming in the open water made her feel free and connected to nature. Mirror Lake is my favorite place in the world, Emma had written. When I'm swimming there, I feel like I could swim forever. Dad says I'm like a mermaid, and sometimes I think he might be right. Mark decided to take Emma's training log with him to Mirror Lake and read it there, in the place where she had felt most at home. It would be his way of saying goodbye and finally accepting that she was gone. The lake looked exactly as it had 5 years earlier when Emma had disappeared. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the surrounding mountains and pine trees. Mark sat in the same spot where he had watched Emma swim for the last time, remembering her enthusiasm and skill in the water. As he read through Emma's training log, Mark found himself crying for the first time since the initial weeks after her disappearance. The grief that he had been holding back for so long finally broke through, and he sobbed for the daughter he had lost and the future that had been stolen from both of them. It was while he was sitting there, lost in his grief and memories, that Mark noticed something unusual on the shore about 100 yards away. There appeared to be some kind of equipment partially buried in the sand and debris that had washed up over the years. Curious, Mark walked over to investigate. What he found was a small action camera, heavily weathered and partially covered with algae and lake sediment. It appeared to have been in the water for a considerable amount of time. Mark's engineering background included some familiarity with waterproof equipment, and he could see that this was a high-quality camera designed for underwater use. Despite its weathered appearance, it looked like it might still be functional. He carefully extracted the camera from the debris and examined it more closely. There was a small LCD screen on the back that might still work if the camera had any battery life remaining. More importantly, if the camera had been recording when it went into the water, there might be footage stored on its memory card. Mark's hands were shaking as he pressed the power button. To his amazement, the camera flickered to life, displaying a low battery warning, but apparently still functional. The LCD screen showed that the camera contained video files, with the most recent ones dated from September 2019, the same month Emma had disappeared. Mark's heart began pounding as he realized the implications. This camera might have been recording during the time Emma was at the lake. There might be footage of what actually happened to his daughter. The camera's battery died before Mark could review the footage, but he immediately drove home and found a compatible charger. His hands were trembling so badly that it took several attempts to connect the charging cable properly. While the camera charged, Mark called Detective Chen to inform her about his discovery. She agreed to meet him at his apartment that evening to review the footage together. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this footage might be difficult to watch," Chen warned him. If this camera was recording when Emma disappeared, it might contain images of her final moments. Mark nodded, understanding the detective's concern, but nothing could have deterred him from viewing the footage. After 5 years of not knowing, he was finally going to see what had happened to his daughter. When Chen arrived, they connected the camera to Mark's laptop and began reviewing the files. The camera appeared to belong to someone who used it regularly for underwater filming, as there were dozens of videos showing fish, underwater plants, and lake geology. The footage from September 12, 2019, began early in the morning and showed the camera being positioned underwater at a depth of about 15 feet, approximately in the center of Mirror Lake. The person operating the camera had apparently been studying the lake's underwater ecosystem. For several hours, the footage showed nothing but underwater scenes. Fish swimming by, sunlight filtering down through the water, and the occasional piece of debris floating past. Mark fast-forwarded through most of this, looking for any sign of Emma. Then, at approximately 2:30 p.m. according to the camera's timestamp, a figure appeared at the surface far above the camera. Even through the water and at a distance, Mark immediately recognized Emma's distinctive swimming stroke. "That's her," Mark told Chen, his voice thick with emotion. "That's Emma." They watched as Emma swam back and forth above the camera, apparently doing her distance training as she had described to Mark that day. Her form looked perfect, and she appeared strong and comfortable in the water. For about 20 minutes, the footage showed Emma swimming normally above the camera's position. Mark found himself mesmerized by seeing his daughter alive and doing what she loved most, even though he knew what was coming. Then, at approximately 2:52 p.m., something changed. The footage showed Emma stopping mid-stroke and floating at the surface, apparently treading water. She appeared to be looking around, as if she had seen or heard something that concerned her. "She's looking toward the shore," Chen observed. "Do you see how she's turned her head in that direction?" Mark nodded, remembering that this was around the time he had noticed Emma's distress from his position on the shore. But the camera's underwater perspective provided additional details that Mark hadn't been able to see from land. The footage showed Emma beginning to swim toward shore, but her stroke rhythm was different from before, faster and less efficient, suggesting urgency or panic. She swam for about 30 seconds in this manner before something extraordinary happened. A large, dark shape appeared in the water near Emma. At first, Mark thought it might be a large fish or piece of debris, but as he watched more carefully, he realized it was something else entirely. "What is that?" Mark asked Chen, pausing the video. Chen leaned closer to the laptop screen, studying the image carefully. "I'm not sure. Can you replay that section?" They watched the sequence several times, and it became clear that the dark shape was actually a person in dark diving gear, including what appeared to be a full wetsuit and scuba equipment. The figure had approached Emma from below and behind, completely invisible to Mark, who had been watching from the shore. "Someone was in the water with her," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone was stalking my daughter." The footage showed the diver grabbing Emma from behind. She clearly struggled, thrashing in the water and trying to break free. The camera captured her head going under and surfacing several times as she fought against her attacker. Mark watched in horror as his daughter battled for her life in the water, while he had been sitting helplessly on the shore, unaware of what was actually happening. The distance and the angle from his position had made it impossible for him to see the underwater struggle. The footage showed Emma continuing to fight for several minutes, but the person attacking her was clearly larger and stronger, and had the advantage of breathing equipment. Gradually, Emma's struggles became weaker, and finally, both figures disappeared beneath the surface. The camera continued recording for several more hours, but neither Emma nor her attacker ever reappeared in the footage. The lake returned to its previous peaceful state, showing no trace of the violence that had just occurred. Mark sat in stunned silence, processing what he had just witnessed. After 5 years of not knowing, he finally had answers, but they were far worse than anything he had imagined. "This is now a murder investigation," Detective Chen said quietly. "Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry. I know this must be incredibly difficult to see." Mark nodded, unable to speak. The footage had confirmed his worst fears, while simultaneously providing the answers he had desperately needed. Emma hadn't drowned accidentally. She had been murdered by someone who had been waiting for her in the lake. Chen immediately called for additional investigators and forensic experts to analyze the camera footage. The video was enhanced and studied frame by frame, looking for any details that might help identify Emma's killer. The enhanced footage revealed several important details. The attacker was definitely wearing professional-grade diving equipment, including a full face mask that completely obscured their identity. The person appeared to be of medium build and height, but it was impossible to determine gender or other identifying characteristics from the footage. More disturbing was the realization that this had been a planned attack. The diver had been positioned in the exact center of the lake, waiting at a depth where they would be invisible to anyone on the surface. This suggested that Emma's killer had knowledge of her swimming routine and had specifically targeted her. This person knew that Emma came to this lake regularly. Detective Chen explained to Mark. They knew her patterns, her preferred swimming routes, and they were prepared with specialized equipment. This wasn't a random crime. Emma was specifically targeted. The investigation was reopened with a much larger team of detectives and forensic specialists. They began by trying to identify who might have had access to professional diving equipment and knowledge of Emma's swimming schedule. The list of people who knew about Emma's regular visits to Mirror Lake was relatively short. It included her swimming coach Janet Morrison, several teammates from her swim club, and a few family friends who had occasionally joined them on trips to the lake. Each of these individuals was interviewed extensively and asked to provide alibis for the day of Emma's disappearance. They were also asked about their diving experience and access to underwater equipment. Janet Morrison was deeply shaken by the revelation that Emma had been murdered. "I can't imagine who would want to hurt Emma," she told investigators. "She was the sweetest kid, and everyone at the swim club loved her." Morrison provided a solid alibi for the day. Emma disappeared She had been coaching at a swim meet in Colorado Springs with dozens of witnesses who could confirm her presence there throughout the day. Emma's teammates and their families were similarly cleared through alibi verification and background checks. None of them had the diving experience or equipment that would have been necessary to carry out the attack shown in the footage. The investigation expanded to include people who might have observed Emma at Mirror Lake without Mark's knowledge. The lake was remote, but it was possible that other visitors had been there on previous occasions and had seen Emma swimming. Investigators canvassed the surrounding area, speaking with residents of nearby cabins and asking about any suspicious activity or unfamiliar vehicles they might have seen in the months leading up to Emma's disappearance. This line of inquiry led to an interesting discovery. Several residents reported seeing a white van parked at various locations near Mirror Lake on multiple occasions throughout the summer of 2019. The van was always parked just out of sight of the main access road, and no one had ever seen the driver. The van was there maybe 6 or 8 times over the course of the summer, one resident told investigators. Always the same spot, hidden behind some trees, where you couldn't see it unless you knew where to look. The description of the van's location matched perfectly with a position that would provide a clear view of the lake while remaining hidden from anyone approaching by the normal access road. It appeared that someone had been surveilling Emma's swimming activities for months before the attack. The investigation team brought in additional resources, including FBI profilers who specialized in predatory crimes against children. The profile they developed suggested that Emma's killer was likely an adult male, with extensive diving experience who had developed an unhealthy obsession with Emma. This type of predator often begins with surveillance and fantasy, before escalating to actual attack, the FBI profiler explained to the investigation team. The level of planning and preparation we see here suggests someone who had been thinking about this crime for a considerable time. The profiler also noted that the killer's choice to attack Emma in deep water using diving equipment suggested either military or professional diving experience. This significantly narrowed the pool of potential suspects. Mark was both relieved and devastated by these developments. After 5 years of uncertainty, he finally knew what had happened to Emma, but the knowledge that she had been deliberately murdered by someone who had stalked her was almost unbearable. "I keep thinking about all those times we went to the lake," Mark told Dr. Martinez during one of his therapy sessions. "Someone was watching her, planning to hurt her, and I had no idea. I feel like I failed to protect her." Dr. Martinez helped Mark understand that he couldn't have known about the hidden threat, and that the sophisticated nature of the surveillance and attack would have been impossible for him to detect or prevent. The investigation continued for months, following every possible lead and examining every piece of evidence. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided additional insights into the type of person who would commit such a crime and the methods they might use. One significant breakthrough came when forensic analysts discovered that the underwater camera hadn't belonged to Emma's killer. The camera's memory card contained months of footage showing it had been placed in the lake by a marine biology student who was studying the lake's ecosystem for his master's thesis. The student, David Park, had been conducting his research with proper permits from the state wildlife department. His camera had been positioned to record fish behavior and had accidentally captured Emma's murder. "I set up the camera in June and was planning to retrieve it in October," Park explained to investigators. "I never imagined it would record something like this. I wish I had been there that day. Maybe I could have helped her." Park's research timeline explained why the camera had remained in the lake for so long after Emma's disappearance. The student had been focused on his studies and hadn't reviewed the footage until much later, when he discovered what the camera had recorded. This revelation also provided additional evidence about the planning that had gone into Emma's murder. The killer couldn't have known about the underwater camera, which meant they had committed the crime despite the risk of being recorded. This suggested either supreme confidence or reckless obsession. The investigation team used advanced video analysis techniques to extract every possible detail from the underwater footage. They were able to determine the approximate size and build of the killer, as well as details about the diving equipment that was used. The diving gear appeared to be military or commercial grade, not the type typically available to recreational divers. This supported the profiler's assessment that the killer likely had professional diving experience. A breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered that a former Navy SEAL named Marcus Sullivan had been living in the area during the time of Emma's disappearance. Sullivan had been dishonorably discharged from the military for inappropriate conduct and had a history of stalking young women. Sullivan's background check revealed that he had extensive underwater combat training and would have had easy access to the type of professional diving equipment seen in the footage. More importantly, investigators discovered that Sullivan had been working as a part-time instructor at a local dive shop during the summer of 20. The dive shop was located less than 30 miles from Mirror Lake, and Sullivan would have been familiar with the area and its diving conditions. Shop records showed that he had checked out professional diving equipment on several occasions during the summer, including the week of Emma's disappearance. When investigators attempted to locate Sullivan for questioning, they discovered that he had left the area abruptly in late September 2019, just days after Emma's disappearance. His forwarding address had been false, and he hadn't been seen or heard from since. A nationwide manhunt was launched for Marcus Sullivan. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, and he was added to the FBI's most wanted list for the murder of Emma Thompson. The case received renewed media attention, with Emma's story being featured on national news programs and true crime shows. Mark participated in many of these interviews, hoping that the publicity would help locate Sullivan and bring justice for Emma. "For 5 years, I've lived with not knowing what happened to my daughter," Mark said during one television interview. "Now I know the truth, and I want everyone to see Marcus Sullivan's face. Someone out there knows where he is." The media coverage generated hundreds of tips from people who claimed to have seen Sullivan or who had information about his possible whereabouts. Each tip was investigated thoroughly, but none led to Sullivan's capture. 6 months after Sullivan was identified as the primary suspect, investigators received a credible tip from a woman in Arizona who claimed to have seen him at a campground near Phoenix. When authorities arrived at the location, they found evidence that Sullivan had been there, but he had disappeared again. "He's clearly been living off the grid," Detective Chen explained to Mark. "Someone with Sullivan's military training would know how to avoid detection and survive without leaving a paper trail." The search for Sullivan continued, but as months passed without any solid leads, the investigation began to focus on other aspects of the case. Investigators worked to build a comprehensive case against Sullivan, so that when he was eventually captured, they would be ready to prosecute him for Emma's murder. The underwater footage provided the strongest evidence, clearly showing the attack on Emma and the killer's use of professional diving equipment. Combined with Sullivan's military background, his access to diving gear, and his suspicious disappearance immediately after the murder, prosecutors felt confident they could secure a conviction. 2 years after Sullivan was identified as the suspect, Mark received a call that he had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Marcus Sullivan had been arrested in Mexico, where he had been living under a false identity. "We got him," Detective Chen told Mark over the phone. Sullivan was arrested by Mexican authorities after a bar fight in Tijuana. When they ran his fingerprints, they discovered his true identity and contacted us immediately. Mark felt a complex mixture of emotions upon hearing this news. Relief that Emma's killer had finally been captured was tempered by the knowledge that nothing could bring his daughter back. Still, the prospect of justice being served provided some measure of closure. The extradition process took several months, but eventually Sullivan was returned to Colorado to face charges for Emma's murder. The trial was scheduled for the following year, giving prosecutors time to prepare their case and Mark time to prepare himself for the ordeal of testifying. During the pre-trial proceedings, Sullivan's defense team attempted to have the underwater footage excluded from evidence, claiming that it was too prejudicial and that Sullivan's identity couldn't be definitively established from the video. However, the judge ruled that the footage was admissible and formed a crucial part of the prosecution's case. Mark attended every hearing and meeting with prosecutors, determined to see justice done for Emma. The process was emotionally exhausting, but he drew strength from knowing that his daughter's killer would finally be held accountable. The trial began 18 months after Sullivan's arrest, generating significant media attention due to the unusual circumstances of the case and the dramatic underwater footage. Mark testified about Emma's swimming abilities and their routine visits to Mirror Lake, establishing the background for the prosecution's case. The underwater footage was played in its entirety during the trial, providing the jury with a clear view of Emma's final moments and the deliberate nature of her murder. Many jury members were visibly affected by the video, and several had to take breaks during the viewing. Sullivan's defense team attempted to argue that their client suffered from PTSD related to his military service, and that he wasn't responsible for his actions. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that the crime had been carefully planned and executed, showing clear intent and premeditation. Expert witnesses testified about the diving equipment used in the attack and confirmed that it matched gear that Sullivan had access to through the dive shop where he worked. Marine biology student David Park testified about his research project and how his camera had accidentally captured the crime. Detective Chen presented the investigation timeline, showing how Sullivan had disappeared immediately after Emma's murder and had lived under false identities for years while evading capture. The pattern of behavior painted a picture of a man who knew exactly what he had done and had taken steps to avoid responsibility. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with emotional testimony from Mark, Emma's swimming coach, and other members of the community who had known and loved Emma. Character witnesses described Emma as a bright, talented young woman with unlimited potential who had been stolen from her family and community. In his closing argument, the prosecutor told the jury, Emma Thompson was just 12 years old when Marcus Sullivan decided to end her life. She was an accomplished swimmer, a loving daughter, and a young person with dreams and aspirations. Sullivan stalked her, planned her murder, and executed it with cold precision. The underwater footage shows us exactly what happened in Emma's final moments, and it demands justice. The defense's closing argument focused on Sullivan's military service and claimed psychological trauma, but it rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the defendant's years of successful evasion of law enforcement. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges: first-degree murder, stalking, and kidnapping. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mark was present in the courtroom when the verdict was read. He felt a profound sense of relief mixed with continued grief. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring Emma back or erase the pain of losing her. The verdict doesn't bring Emma home, Mark told reporters outside the courthouse, but it ensures that Marcus Sullivan will never be able to hurt another child. That's something Emma would have wanted. She would have wanted to protect other kids. During the sentencing hearing, Mark was given the opportunity to address Sullivan directly. It was the first time the two men had been in the same room since Emma's disappearance, and Mark had spent weeks preparing what he wanted to say. Marcus Sullivan, Mark began, his voice steady despite his emotions. You stole my daughter from me. You took away her future, her dreams, her chance to grow up and make her mark on the world. Emma was 12 years old, and she loved swimming more than anything else. You turned her greatest joy into the instrument of her death. Mark continued, but you didn't just kill Emma that day. You tried to destroy me too, and for 5 years, you nearly succeeded. You made me doubt myself, blame myself, and live with unbearable uncertainty. But Emma's spirit was stronger than your evil intentions. The truth came out, and now you'll spend the rest of your life paying for what you did. Sullivan showed no emotion during Mark's statement, maintaining the same cold demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. When given the opportunity to speak, he declined, offering no apology or explanation for his actions. Judge Patricia Williams imposed the maximum sentence allowed by law: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for the stalking and kidnapping charges. In her sentencing remarks, she described the crime as one of the most calculated and heinous acts she had encountered in her judicial career. Emma Thompson was a child with her whole life ahead of her. Judge Williams said, Marcus Sullivan robbed her of that future and caused immeasurable pain to her family and community. This sentence ensures that he will never have the opportunity to harm another person. Following the trial, Mark began the long process of truly grieving for Emma and rebuilding his life. The 5 years of uncertainty had prevented him from moving through the normal stages of grief, but now that he had answers and justice, he could begin to heal. He returned to his work as an engineer, but also became involved in advocacy for missing children and their families. His experience with ambiguous loss and the importance of never giving up hope resonated with other parents facing similar situations. Mark also worked with law enforcement agencies to improve investigation techniques for missing persons cases, particularly those involving bodies of water. Emma's case had demonstrated the importance of thoroughly searching, not just for the victim, but for any evidence that might have been left behind by perpetrators. The underwater camera that had captured Emma's murder became a key piece of evidence in training programs for water rescue and recovery teams. The footage, while difficult to watch, provided valuable insights into how crimes could be committed in aquatic environments and the importance of considering all possibilities during investigations. 3 years after Sullivan's conviction, Mark established the Emma Thompson Foundation, dedicated to supporting young swimmers from disadvantaged backgrounds and funding research into water safety and crime prevention. The foundation's motto, "Swimming Toward Hope," reflected Mark's belief that Emma's memory should inspire positive change rather than just serve as a reminder of tragedy. Mark also began visiting Mirror Lake again, not to grieve but to remember the happy times he and Emma had shared there. He would sometimes bring flowers and sit by the water, telling Emma about the foundation's work and the young swimmers who were benefiting from scholarships in her name. "I used to avoid this place because it reminded me of losing Emma," Mark explained to a documentary filmmaker who was creating a program about the case. "But now I come here to remember her joy and passion for swimming. This lake was where she felt most free and alive, and I want to honor that memory." The documentary about Emma's case aired on a major network and helped raise awareness about the dangers that children can face even in seemingly safe environments. It also highlighted the importance of never giving up hope in missing persons cases, and the role that technology could play in solving cold cases. Mark was interviewed extensively for the documentary, sharing both his grief and his hope that Emma's story could help other families. "Emma loved helping people," he said during one interview. "If her story can help protect other children or give hope to families of missing persons, then something positive will have come from this tragedy." The case also led to changes in how law enforcement agencies investigate disappearances involving bodies of water. New protocols were established for underwater searches, including the use of remote cameras and sonar equipment that might detect evidence that traditional dive teams could miss. Emma's swimming coach, Janet Morrison, established a memorial scholarship at the Aquatic Center, where Emma had trained. Each year, the scholarship was awarded to a young swimmer who demonstrated Emma's combination of talent, dedication, and sportsmanship. Emma was special not just because of her swimming ability, but because of who she was as a person. Morrison said at the first scholarship ceremony, "She was kind, determined, and always encouraging to her teammates. We want to honor that spirit by helping other young swimmers achieve their dreams." The scholarship recipients were required to participate in community service activities, continuing Emma's legacy of helping others. Many of the recipients went on to successful swimming careers, with several earning college scholarships and one eventually making the U.S. national team. 5 years after Sullivan's conviction, Mark met and began dating Dr. Rachel Martinez, a trauma counselor who worked with families of crime victims. Rachel understood the unique challenges that Mark faced and supported his continued involvement in advocacy and memorial activities for Emma. "Mark will always love Emma first, and I respect that," Rachel said when asked about their relationship. "My role isn't to replace Emma's memory, but to support Mark as he continues to honor her legacy and build a meaningful life." Mark and Rachel married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family members, including several of Emma's former teammates who had remained in touch with Mark over the years. Emma's presence was acknowledged through photos and a memorial candle, ensuring that she remained part of Mark's new beginning. The couple settled in a house near the mountains, where Mark could continue his outdoor activities while staying connected to the landscape that he and Emma had both loved. Rachel's work with trauma survivors complemented Mark's advocacy efforts, and together they helped many families navigate the aftermath of violent crimes. 10 years after Emma's murder, Marcus Sullivan died in prison of natural causes. Mark received notification of his death, but felt no sense of satisfaction or closure from it. Sullivan's death couldn't undo the harm he had caused, and Mark had long since realized that his healing didn't depend on what happened to Emma's killer. Sullivan's death doesn't change anything for me, Mark told a reporter. Emma is still gone, and nothing will ever bring her back. My focus has always been on honoring her memory and helping other families, not on what happened to the man who killed her. The Emma Thompson Foundation continued to grow and expand its mission. In addition to swimming scholarships, it began funding research into child safety technology and supporting organizations that helped families of missing persons. The foundation also established an annual swimming meet in Emma's memory, bringing together young swimmers from across the region. Mark often spoke at the memorial swim meet, sharing Emma's story with a new generation of swimmers and their families. His message was always the same: cherish every moment with your loved ones, stay vigilant about safety, and never give up hope in the face of adversity. Emma taught me that life is precious and fragile. Mark would tell the young swimmers, she also taught me that love is stronger than loss, and that we can honor those we've lost by living with purpose and helping others. 15 years after Emma's disappearance, Mark was invited to speak at a national conference on missing children. His presentation focused on the importance of emerging technologies in solving cold cases and the need for families to advocate for continued investigation of unsolved disappearances. During his presentation, Mark displayed the last photo ever taken of Emma, showing her diving gracefully into Mirror Lake just hours before her murder. This picture captures everything I want you to remember about Emma. He told the audience, she was fearless, graceful, and completely in her element. She died doing what she loved most, and while that doesn't make her loss any easier to bear, it reminds me that she lived fully in her 12 years. The presentation received a standing ovation, and many attendees approached Mark afterward to share their own stories and seek advice about their missing loved ones. Mark spent hours after his formal presentation talking with families, offering support and encouragement based on his own experience. One family that particularly touched Mark was the Johnsons, whose teenage son had disappeared while hiking 3 years earlier. Like Mark, they had lived with uncertainty and hope, never knowing whether their child was alive or dead. Your story gives us hope that we'll eventually get answers, Mrs. Johnson told Mark. Even if the answers are painful, we need to know what happened to Tyler. The not knowing is destroying our family. Mark understood exactly what Mrs. Johnson was going through and stayed in regular contact with the family, providing support and advocacy assistance. 6 months later, he was able to call them with good news. New search techniques had located Tyler's remains, and while the outcome wasn't what the family had hoped for, they finally had closure. As Mark approached the 20th anniversary of Emma's disappearance, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that terrible day at Mirror Lake. He had rebuilt his life, found love again, and created meaningful work that honored Emma's memory. The pain of losing her would never fully go away, but it had been transformed into purpose and hope. The underwater camera that had revealed the truth about Emma's murder was eventually donated to a law enforcement training center, where it was used to teach investigators about the importance of thorough evidence collection and the potential for technology to solve seemingly impossible cases. Mark sometimes wondered what Emma would think of the foundation established in her name and the lives it had touched. He believed she would be proud of the young swimmers who had received scholarships and the families who had found hope through the foundation's work. Emma always wanted to make a difference in the world, Mark said during an interview for the foundation's 20th anniversary publication. She didn't get the chance to do that in her own lifetime, but through the foundation and through the changes that her case brought about, she's still making a difference today. The Mirror Lake where Emma died was eventually designated as a memorial site, with improved safety features and a small monument recognizing all victims of violent crime. The lake remained open for swimming and recreation, as Mark believed Emma would have wanted it that way. Mark continued to visit the lake regularly, but his visits had evolved from grief-filled pilgrimages to peaceful moments of remembrance and connection. He would often bring young swimmers from the foundation's programs to the lake, teaching them about water safety while sharing Emma's story. "This lake took my daughter away from me," Mark would tell the young swimmers, "but it was also where she was happiest. I want you to love swimming and the water, But I also want you to be smart and safe. Emma would want that too. The case of Emma Thompson's disappearance and the eventual discovery of the underwater footage that revealed her murder became a landmark case in law enforcement training. It demonstrated the importance of never closing cold cases, the potential for new evidence to emerge years later, and the power of technology to provide answers that seemed impossible to obtain. Mark Thompson's journey from devastated father to advocate and foundation founder inspired countless other families facing similar tragedies. His refusal to give up hope and his transformation of grief into action showed that even the most terrible losses could ultimately serve a greater purpose. 21 years after losing Emma, Mark stood before another group of young swimmers at the annual Emma Thompson Memorial Swim Meet. As he looked out at their eager faces, he saw reflections of his daughter's passion and determination. Emma Thompson was 12 years old when she was taken from us. Mark began his annual address to the swimmers. She was talented, dedicated, and full of dreams about her future in swimming. While her life was cut short, her spirit lives on in each of you. Every time you dive into the water, every time you push yourself to swim a little faster or a little further, you're honoring Emma's memory. The swimmers listened intently, understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves. Many of them had grown up hearing Emma's story and knowing that their opportunities to swim and compete were made possible by a foundation created to honor a girl who had died doing what she loved. As the swim meet began, and Mark watched the young athletes competing in the pool, he felt Emma's presence strongly. The sound of swimmers cutting through the water, the cheers of encouragement from coaches and parents, and the determination on the faces of the competitors all reminded him of Emma's joy in swimming. The underwater camera that had revealed the truth about Emma's murder had literally surfaced at the right moment, providing answers when Mark needed them most. That small piece of technology had changed everything, transforming an unsolved disappearance into a solved murder case, and giving Mark the closure he needed to move forward with his life. The legacy of Emma Thompson lived on not just in the foundation that bore her name, but in the improvements to missing persons investigations, the young swimmers who benefited from scholarships, and the families who found hope in Mark's story of perseverance and eventual justice. As Mark watched the swimmers compete that day, he knew that Emma's story would continue to inspire and protect others for years to come. The daughter he had lost at Mirror Lake had become a symbol of hope for families everywhere, proving that love transcends death and that good can ultimately triumph over evil. The old GoPro camera that had washed up on the shore of Mirror Lake 5 years after Emma's disappearance had done more than just solve a murder. It had restored a father's faith, brought justice to a killer, and created a lasting legacy that would help protect and inspire children for generations to come. In the end, Emma Thompson's story was not just about a tragic loss, but about the power of a father's love, the importance of never giving up hope, and the potential for technology to reveal truths that seemed impossible to discover. It was a story that proved that even in the darkest circumstances, light could eventually break through, bringing justice, healing, and hope to those who needed it most.